by scratching the surface, you get a terrible shock. It's it's a heinous crime. People are so shocked by what...
The document was never supposed to emerge like this. Hidden among the late Queen's most sensitive private instructions was a decree capable of changing Camilla's royal life overnight. When King Charles finally read its central clause, the room fell silent. It did not merely reduce a privilege or alter protocol. It ordered the removal of Queen Camilla's residential rights across every property she occupied through the crown, and demanded that the decision be enforced. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles read the instruction again, slower this time, hoping a second reading might soften its meaning. It did not. The sealed decree left by Queen Elizabeth II ordered Camilla to surrender every residential privilege attached to crown property: private apartments, reserved rooms, household access, and keys. A crown residence is property held for the monarchy's official use, rather than a home personally owned by the royal occupying it. That meant the order could reach Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and other spaces tied to her position, while leaving private property untouched. Camilla entered after being summoned and knew from Charles's face that something had broken. He read the central clause aloud, keeping his voice level even as the words placed him between his mother's instruction and his wife's future. She gripped the chair beside her. "All of them?" she asked. The king gave one restrained confirmation. For her, the blow was larger than losing rooms. Those spaces represented security after years of judgment, struggle, and uncertainty inside royal life. Then the decree revealed its second wound. Elizabeth had ordered that it remain sealed until a specific constitutional condition was met, meaning this was not an angry note forgotten in a drawer. The condition had now been triggered. Worse for Charles, the document named William as a required witness to its activation. The prince could not be excluded, and the king could not quietly bury the order without his heir knowing he had chosen to ignore it. Camilla's shock hardened into something colder. Someone had persuaded the late monarch that the future stability of the household required a safeguard this severe, and the wording showed careful planning. Charles looked from the decree to his wife and understood that the real danger was no longer access. It was the question behind it, and neither of them yet knew how deeply that question reached. But before anyone could understand why the Queen had gone so far, Charles, Camilla, and William had to confront what each of them stood to lose when a family dispute suddenly became an order from beyond the grave. For Charles, this was no longer simply an instruction about rooms, keys, or palace corridors. It had become a choice between the woman beside him and the written wishes of the mother, whose reign had shaped nearly every part of his life. Camilla felt the decree as something brutally personal. William, standing only a few feet away, understood that the question had already changed. Nobody was asking whether the order existed anymore. They were waiting to see whether the king would obey it. Charles carried the heaviest burden because the final act of enforcement rested with him. As the reigning monarch, he held the authority to direct the royal household, but the wording had been designed to make ignoring the instruction impossible without consequence. William's position was different, but equally uncomfortable. As heir to the throne, the person next in line to become monarch, he had been named as a witness, not as the author of Camilla's removal. His presence meant the matter could never quietly disappear into a private compromise between husband and wife. Camilla could not reduce the loss to property. Those rooms had represented years spent fighting for acceptance, enduring judgment, and slowly building a place inside royal life that once seemed impossible. Now the queen consort felt that the institution was telling her something far colder. Her place had always depended on permission. She turned toward Charles after the aides left, waiting until the door closed before asking the question she had been holding back. "Are you going to fight this?" Charles looked down at his hands before answering. He wanted to protect her, But he also knew that defying the decree without understanding its purpose could place him against his mother's final intention. The king told her he first needed to know why Elizabeth had made the order so difficult to ignore. Camilla heard caution where she had hoped for certainty, and that hesitation cut deeper than an immediate refusal might have done. William returned to the document and noticed something neither of them had fully understood. Several lines carried handwritten annotations added after the original draft. The prince carefully compared the dates and realized the late queen had revisited the instruction more than once. She had not signed it and forgotten it. She had returned to it, strengthened it, and left evidence of exactly when her concern became serious. Then one phrase changed the room again. Beside a later amendment were 3 words: the Windsor incident. Camilla stared at the note, but William immediately recognized the date written beside it. Charles saw the reaction on his son's face and knew this was no vague reference. And when the family began retracing that date, the decree stopped looking like an old precaution and started looking like the final consequence of one unforgettable encounter. Every family crisis has one moment that looks small, until everything later points back to it. For this family, that moment came at Windsor, during the final stretch of the Platinum Jubilee celebrations. The public celebrations were ending, the smiles had faded, and the private conversations had begun. What happened next lasted only minutes, yet the handwritten note William had just uncovered showed that Elizabeth remembered it clearly enough to change the decree afterward. Camilla had been worried about what would happen once Charles became king. The succession meant more than a new monarch. It would also reshape household offices, private apartments, staff arrangements, and access across crown residences. Those residences are homes and working spaces held for the monarchy, rather than personal property, belonging permanently to whoever occupies them. She wanted certainty that the rooms and privileges attached to her future position would not disappear later under pressure from William or a changing royal household. Elizabeth saw the danger differently. The Queen had tolerated discussions about transition because some planning was unavoidable, but she believed royal residences could never become trophies inside family rivalries. To her, permanent guarantees risked turning institutional space into personal territory. That fear sharpened during a private Windsor conversation when Camilla pressed a senior household official for confirmation that several principal rooms, offices, and residential privileges would remain attached to her position after the succession. Then the atmosphere changed. Elizabeth entered during the exchange and heard enough to understand what was being requested. The monarch stopped the discussion calmly and asked everyone except Camilla to leave. No shouting followed. That made the moment worse. She asked why such guarantees were necessary before the crown had even changed hands, and Camilla answered that she was trying to avoid future uncertainty, not seize control. But the Queen heard insecurity turning into expectation. Hours later, Elizabeth summoned her private secretary and reopened an existing draft. According to the documented account preserved with the sealed papers, she ordered a new clause added. It removed automatic crown residence rights from Camilla if the monarch concluded those privileges threatened household stability. The Queen Consort had believed the Windsor conversation was about protection. Elizabeth had treated it as a warning. Charles now understood why those 3 words had been written beside the amendment. William understood it too, but Camilla refused to accept that one conversation, stripped of context, should define everything that followed. With the past suddenly exposed, Camilla no longer wanted explanations from a document. She wanted Charles and William to tell her, face to face, whether they intended to let that single Windsor conversation determine her future. The restraint finally broke behind a closed palace door. No cameras, no ceremony, no carefully prepared statement. Only Charles, William, Camilla, and the sealed decree resting between them. She had already heard what the order required. But now she wanted something more dangerous than an explanation. She wanted an answer from the two men whose choices would turn those words into reality. Charles called the meeting because the next step could no longer be avoided. He had to decide whether implementation would begin at once or whether he would search for some way to delay it while reviewing his mother's intent. William entered with one clear position. This could not become another argument about Diana, old wounds, or years of family resentment. The prince insisted that the only question before them was whether Elizabeth's written instruction would be honored. Camilla turned toward her husband before anyone could soften the discussion. "Are you really going to do this?" she asked. The king began carefully, saying he was still examining the wording, but she pushed her chair back before he could finish. To her, this was not about architecture, rooms, or keys. It was about whether the place she had spent years building beside him could disappear the moment an old document was opened. William stayed controlled until the queen consort turned on him. She accused him of welcoming the decree because it removed a problem he might otherwise have faced later. The future king's expression hardened. He told her he had not written the order, had not requested it, and would not pretend it did not exist simply because enforcing it was painful. Camilla heard no triumph in his voice, but she heard something just as difficult: resolve. Then Charles revealed the part he had held back. The decree contained an enforcement timetable. Once activated, household keys, private residential control, and assigned access had to be transferred within days. An attached schedule, a formal list setting out exactly which properties and privileges were covered. Named one residence Camilla had assumed would remain untouched. She stared at the page. That final hope vanished instantly. Charles ended the argument before it could become cruel. He told them he would consult the small group empowered to authenticate the order, meaning the people responsible for confirming that the document was genuine, valid, and ready to enforce. But his tone had changed. He already understood that Elizabeth had designed the decree to survive resistance. Camilla had challenged the men standing in front of her. Now she was about to confront something harder to fight. A system the late queen had deliberately built so that emotion could not overturn her final instruction. Charles still wore the crown, but the decree had made his authority feel narrower than ever. His mother had understood that someone might one day try to delay, soften, or reinterpret what she had written. So she had built protection around every line. The deeper he went into the papers, the clearer it became that Elizabeth had expected resistance, and had made sure resistance would leave a record. William joined the tightly controlled review, because his name appeared as the dynastic witness, meaning the family member formally required to confirm that the order had reached the point of activation. Designated household officials checked signatures, dates, sealed schedules, and the attached instructions before the decree could move forward. None of them could simply erase the decision. That was the document's real strength. It did not take power away from Charles as king. It made any choice to ignore the order visible, deliberate, and personally his. Charles hated that distinction. He understood why his mother had written safeguards, yet every safeguard now pushed him closer to humiliating Camilla. Loyalty to Elizabeth pulled one way. His instinct to protect his wife pulled the other. William watched him struggle and understood that this was no victory for anyone. The future king had wanted clarity, but clarity had arrived carrying pain. Then the final memorandum changed the meaning of the decree again. Elizabeth had written that crown residences must serve the continuity of the monarchy first, and could never become permanent emotional security for any one consort. A memorandum is a written note explaining the reasoning behind an official decision, and this one made her purpose painfully direct. She had not wanted rooms, offices, or access to become proof of personal ownership simply because someone stood beside the monarch. William noticed another layer hidden inside that reasoning. By making the removals automatic once the conditions were met, The late Queen had also protected Charles from appearing personally vindictive. The king would still have to enforce the decision, but he could truthfully say he had not invented it, expanded it, or chosen its timing. Charles finally sat alone with the authenticated copy. He removed his glasses, pressed his fingers against his forehead, and said nothing, while an aide waited beside the table. Seconds stretched. Then he looked up. "Prepare the transfer." That sentence ended the argument. Household teams received instructions. Inventories were opened. Access records were reviewed. And Camilla was told exactly when the first keys would have to be surrendered. The argument had ended on paper. Now the decree was about to enter bedrooms, desks, locked doors, and familiar corridors, turning royal language into consequences Camilla could physically feel. The most devastating moment was almost painfully ordinary. There was no proclamation, no public removal, no grand announcement. A household official arrived with a ledger, an inventory sheet, and a small velvet tray. For Camilla, the decree finally became real when she reached into her bag, removed a familiar key, and understood that she would never use it in the same way again. Camilla had already been told what the transfer involved, but hearing the list and surrendering the objects were two different things. Keys, private entry permissions, residential offices, reserved rooms, and household authorizations were being returned to direct crown control. That meant the monarchy, rather than the individual royal using the space, would decide who could enter and occupy it. Her personal possessions remained hers, but the automatic right to the rooms surrounding those possessions was disappearing. Camilla placed the first key onto the tray and hesitated. For a second, her fingers stayed near it, as if instinct had not caught up with reality. Then she pulled her hand back without speaking. The official completed the entry in the ledger, gathered the items, and left. She remained standing after the door closed, unwilling to sit in a room that suddenly felt temporary. Charles entered shortly afterward and expected anger. Instead, he found something quieter and harder to answer. Camilla told him that anger would be easier because anger at least gave a person somewhere to stand. The king understood exactly what she meant. Rage could be fought. Humiliation had nowhere to go. He tried to reassure her that the decree did not erase her place beside him, but she answered that it had already changed how that place felt. Then another consequence arrived. Household staff began removing Camilla's personal scheduling control from certain apartments before the physical transfer was even complete. She could no longer automatically reserve some spaces for private meetings or household use. The decree was not only changing where she could live, it was stripping away authority she had assumed came naturally with her position. William learned how quickly the process was moving and gave a quiet instruction of his own. The prince ordered staff to avoid any unnecessary spectacle, gossip, or public handling that might turn compliance into punishment. He supported the decree, but he did not want Camilla humiliated for obeying it. That gesture reached her. The first key had been surrendered, but something else had shifted with it. The confrontation was giving way to a quieter question about whether two people divided by history could finally speak without Charles, courtiers, or the crown between them. For years, too much history had stood between them. Diana, Charles, public judgment, loyalty, silence. But when Camilla asked William for a private conversation, neither brought an aide into the room. There would be no secretaries taking notes, and no monarch standing between them. She had already lost the argument over the decree. What she wanted now was something more personal, to know whether the future king truly believed Elizabeth had been right to fear her place inside the royal household. Camilla requested the meeting after learning that William had quietly told staff to handle every transfer with restraint. That mattered because the practical dispute was already settled. The keys were being surrendered, the access rights were changing, and no palace official could reverse what had begun. The prince agreed because continuing through courtiers would only make the distance between them worse. Camilla sat opposite him and spoke without accusation at first. She said the residences had never felt like trophies to her. They had felt like proof that years of service, pressure, and public judgment had eventually led to a stable place beside Charles. Losing them through one document made her feel as though all of that could be erased in a single stroke. William listened without interrupting, and that silence allowed her to finish what anger had prevented her from saying before. William answered carefully. He told her the decree did not erase her marriage to his father, and it did not erase the work she had done. But it did draw a line between personal belonging and institutional entitlement. The future king explained that crown space could never become a guarantee of emotional security, simply because someone stood beside the monarch. Camilla did not like the distinction, but for the first time she listened without pushing back immediately. Then she admitted something unexpected. The Windsor conversation may have sounded different to Elizabeth than she intended. Camilla still believed the punishment was too severe, but she could now understand why the late queen had heard danger in her demand for permanent guarantees. William answered with a truth of his own. He admitted he had felt relief when the decree removed the possibility of a future residential battle. But he also told her plainly that he had never wanted her publicly humiliated. They left without affection, without dramatic forgiveness, and without pretending history had disappeared. Inside the palace, the emotional battle had begun to cool. Outside it, the country was only just discovering that one of Elizabeth's final hidden decisions had redrawn the boundaries of royal life. By morning, the story had escaped the palace completely. It was on television screens, breakfast tables, phone alerts, and newspaper stands across Britain. Secret Queen's decree became the phrase everyone repeated. But the shock went far beyond Camilla losing rooms. The public was watching a decision made by one queen reach through time to restrict the privileges of another, while Charles was forced to carry it out. Charles watched the first reports in silence. Palace communications had confirmed the residential changes without releasing the full private decree, describing them instead as the implementation of instructions governing crown property. That mattered because the statement separated Camilla's public position from the residences themselves. She remained beside the king, but the apartments, access rights, and household privileges covered by the order would return to direct royal control. Commentators immediately split over what that meant. Camilla saw enough coverage to understand how quickly the story had been simplified. Some broadcasters framed Elizabeth's decision as careful protection of the monarchy. Others treated it as a final judgment against the queen consort. She stopped watching after one discussion described the transfer as her defeat. Instead, she turned to a member of staff and calmly instructed them to continue preparing the remaining personal possessions. The pain was still there, but she refused to perform it for the outside world. Charles found the coverage harder to ignore. He watched one presenter reduce the entire crisis to a battle between his mother and his wife, and his discomfort showed immediately. The king knew the reality was more complicated. Elizabeth had written the decree around institutional boundaries, yet the consequences had fallen on a woman he loved. William understood the same tension, and he resisted any suggestion that the order had been designed as public humiliation. Then one image captured the mood of the country. A morning newspaper appeared on stands opposite Buckingham Palace, with a full-page photograph of Elizabeth, above the words, "Her final boundary." A small crowd gathered near the gates, photographing the front page and arguing over whether the late queen had protected the crown or gone too far. The private family wound had become a national symbol. The palace then issued its clearest clarification yet. Camilla would retain her public role and her marriage to Charles, but the residential privileges covered by the decree would not be restored. That ended the public question. The nation had rendered its opinions, the palace had confirmed the consequences, and the final judgment could no longer come from documents or headlines. It had to come from the people who survived the decree. In the end, No throne changed hands. No marriage collapsed. No dramatic exile followed. Yet the monarchy had still been permanently altered because Elizabeth's decree created something stronger than possession: a boundary. Camilla remained beside Charles, but the residences she had once entered through the authority of her position were no longer hers to command. William did not celebrate. The king did not rebel, and she finally faced what could not be reversed. Camilla completed the final transfers without another confrontation. The remaining keys were surrendered. The last automatic residential privileges were removed, and her personal possessions were separated from the spaces controlled by the crown. Those crown rights meant access granted through royal position rather than personal ownership, and once they were withdrawn, there was no quiet path back. She would continue her public duties and her life beside Charles, but the old residential guarantees were gone. Charles signed the final acknowledgement and carried the document to his wife himself. The king placed it in front of her and waited while she read the final page. Camilla closed the folder, returned it without argument, and looked at him for a long moment. He reached for her hand. This time, she allowed him to hold it. She told him she still believed Elizabeth had judged her too harshly, but she would not let a battle over rooms define the rest of her life beside him. William reached his own conclusion with equal clarity. The prince respected his grandmother's boundary because it separated crown property from personal emotion, but he refused to treat Camilla's loss as a victory. He had gained certainty about the future without turning that certainty into revenge. That distinction mattered because the decree had always been larger than one relationship. It was about where family feeling ended and institutional control began. Charles finally understood his mother's purpose. Elizabeth had not designed the order simply to reach into his marriage from beyond the grave. She had wanted to make sure that proximity to the monarch could never turn royal residence into permanent personal possession. The king accepted the decision, even though accepting it had cost him peace inside his own family. Camilla kept her marriage, her public role, and Charles's support. She lost the residential privileges Elizabeth believed belonged only to the institution. The king chose duty without abandoning his wife. William gained clarity without cruelty, and the late queen's final boundary became permanent. The last key was gone, the decree was fulfilled, and there was nothing left to contest. Camilla remained queen beside Charles, but the crown residences had returned completely to the crown, exactly as Elizabeth intended. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.